What is going on, Chess YouTube? So, Magnus Carlsen is currently playing in two elite chess tournaments. Number one, the Freestyle Chess Grand Slam Tournament, and number two, the Title Tuesday Tournament. And we are looking at his best, most important games from both of these tournaments. Our first game, of course, is Magnus Carlsen versus Vincent Keymer from the Freestyle Chess Grand Slam Tournament. And in this game, the German Grandmaster is going to press Magnus right out of the gate. You don't want to miss this one. Let's dive right in. All right, in the game, Vincent Keymer is playing as white. Now here, the strongest moves for white in this position in freestyle chess include 1 f4, 1 c4, knight to b3, and knight to g3. However, instead in this game, Vincent Keymer opening up on the queen side with the g pawn. 1 g4 is the move, opening up with the queen's pawn. And what is black going to do about it? Well, the strongest move here for Magnus is actually g5, playing very symmetrical, very solid. Instead, 1 knight g6 was chosen by the GOAT. Now Vincent, knight to b3 is the move, getting his knight out into the game, and here black goes e5, gaining space and contrasting his pawn advance with white's one on the g4 square, getting his knight developed behind that pawn on g4. Perhaps that was the idea behind 1 g4 played in the opening. Now here black goes f6, bolstering his pawn on e5 and opening up the scope of this queen on the g8 square, slicing down this diagonal. Now here Vincent gains space on the queen side with the move c4, opening up with the rook's pawn, the rook supporting that pawn on the c4 square. And here Magnus Carlsen plays a very interesting move. He actually castles on the queen side. Queenside castles is the move, just shuffling his king and his rook here, king to c8, castling on the queen side. Now here Vincent, he decides it is time to gain space in the center of the board. d4 was chosen. Of course, that pawn is being supported by the knight on the b3 square. And here, instead of taking on d4, e takes d4 is clearly the strongest idea for black. Instead, Magnus, he plays a very provocative idea, knight b6, putting pressure on that pawn on c4 with both the knight and the queen. However, Vincent Keymer, he has a very simple idea to gain space in the center and relieve all the tension on both these pawns on c4 and d4. Here, Vincent simply goes d5, gaining space, and already on move 6, Vincent Keymer has a commanding advantage out of the opening here, and Magnus will be on the back foot. It's sort of like a modern Ben and I opening, where white obviously has a very strong space advantage on the queen side and in the center. All right, here, black goes d6, getting his pawn triangle in the center of the board. All his pawns are on dark squares, and the problem with this setup here is that bishop on b8 is completely out of the game for now. Now Vincent, bishop f5 is the move, hitting the king on c8 with the bishop immediately. Black goes bishop d7, and here Vincent, he doesn't trade yet. Instead, f3 is the move, getting almost all his pawns here on light squares. Perhaps he wants to trade off his light squared bishop, trying to give black a very bad dark squared bishop in the corner of the board. That is a big part of why white is so much better here. His bishop is just dominating black's one on b8. All right, now black goes a6, controlling that b5 square, potentially setting up a b5 advance later in the game. And now Vincent, he continues with his light squared strategy. He goes e4, gaining space, getting all of his center pawns on light squares here. And the idea being, if black takes on f5, white can recapture with the knight or the g pawn, recapturing towards the center. And again, he has the entire center on complete lockdown. Now black here, he goes for the move, knight to f4, jumping down with the knight, potentially threatening g6 ideas. Therefore here Vincent, he just goes bishop takes d7, trading off those light squared bishops, a perfectly fine idea. And now we have rook takes d7. Now here Vincent plays another very curious looking move. The strongest moves according to the engine include knight a5, developing the knight on the queen side, and queen to e3, centralizing the queen. But instead here Vincent goes king to c2, getting his king off that back rank. Now, of course, a big part of the idea here, the king may want to go to b1, sort of artificially castling the king, but we'll have to wait and see what Vincent has in mind with that move. All right, now here Magnus plays yet another very weird looking move. Bishop to a7, getting his bishop on this diagonal where it does oppose the white queen on g1. Of course, black is threatening ideas like potentially knight takes c4. Of course, the bishop on a7 is undefended, but if the king ever goes to b8, then ideas like knight takes c4 would come into play. And real fast, why did black not take on c4 immediately? Well, it's very simple. If you take on c4, then white can go bishop f2, closing off this diagonal, and that knight on c4 will not have any good retreat squares. If you go back to b6 in the future, then bishop takes b6 would be deadly, and overall, knight takes c4 is just a little bit too risky here for black. Instead, bishop a7 played in the game, again opposing the white queen on g1. Now we have bishop d2, developing the bishop and threatening the knight on the f4 square. And again, if black goes knight takes f4, then you immediately lose that bishop on a7. Therefore, that pawn is still not hanging. So here, Magnus, king b8 is the move, simply defending that bishop on a7. And now, of course, knight takes c4 is officially a threat here. And with that in mind, Vincent does go bishop e3, defending his queen on g1 from the X-ray attack. Now, Magnus, he is not done. Knight to h3, putting pressure on the queen. And now, of course, g1 and f2 are being attacked. That means the queen will have to leave the bishop on e3 undefended for now. In the game, queen g2 was chosen, putting pressure on the knight on h3. Very logical. Black draws back, knight to f4. And here, Vincent, if he wanted it, he could actually go for a draw immediately on the spot. For example, queen g1, knight h3, queen g2, knight f4. That would be a threefold draw by repetition immediately. However, Vincent Keymer on move 15, he is playing for a win, and instead of queen g1, he simply goes queen to f2, sliding over his queen, and again, maintaining the pressure on the bishop on a7. Now here, black, instead of knight to h3, he actually goes h5, gaining space on the king's side, and seemingly playing a temporary pawn sacrifice. If white wants it, he can take on h5 with the knight or the g-pawn, and it's actually not clear how black will regain the pawn in the future. Instead, though, rook fd1 chosen by the German grandmaster. Now we have h takes g4, then f takes g4, and then knight to c8, dropping back with the knight, and of course, increasing the tension on the bishop on e3. Now, does white want to trade on a7, or does he want to keep those bishops on the board for now? Well, it turns out he wants to keep them alive. He goes c5 instead, gaining space on the queen's side in the spirit of perhaps the king's Indian defense. Now, black takes on c5, white takes back, bishop takes c5, and then black goes g6. Kind of a curious move, again, not doing a whole lot on the king's side. Now here, white does trade those bishops. Bishop takes a7 is the move. Then we have knight takes a7, and then king to b1, completing the artificial castling of the king on the b1 square. Now we have queen to h7, getting the queen off the back rank, then knight c5, jumping up with the knight, and pressuring that weak rook on d7. Where is the rook going to go? It goes to d6, a very logical square for that rook, and now we have knight to e2, dropping back with the knight, and increasing the pressure on that knight on f4. And so far, overall, Vincent Keymer, he maintains a very solid advantage in this position. Of course, his pawns on d4 and d5, and e4 are very, very strong, and black has a slight space disadvantage. All right, now here, black trades on e2, knight takes e2, then queen takes e2, and then black jumps up with the knight to b5. So knight b5 played in the game. Magnus trying to reroute his pieces to better squares. Of course, now the idea could be rook d8, then knight d6. That knight does belong on that d6 square, blockading the pawn on d5. But overall, this plan is a little bit slow. And here, Vincent, he lunges out with the queen, queen c4, a very strong move, pressuring that weak pawn on c7. Now here, black does go rook c8, defending c7 in advance with the rook. There are no queen takes c7 ideas coming in the future. Now white goes a4, gaining space and driving back that knight once again before black can go rook d8 and then knight d6. Instead, knight to d4 is played in the game, jumping forward with the knight. But here, Vincent Keymer plays an extremely strong pawn sacrifice, g5. The idea being you are putting pressure on that pawn on f6, and if you take on g5, then the pawn on e5 also becomes very, very weak. Overall, black's pawn structure will be damaged one way or another. Now here, instead of trading on g5, black actually goes rook c to d8, sliding his rook out to the d8 square. But here, white just takes on f6. G takes f6 played in the game. Then we have rook takes f6, and then rook to f1, sliding over with the rook. Now here, black goes rook b6, retreating his rook back to b6 as well. Now rook f2 develops the rook and defends that b2 point in advance. And now here, Magnus, g5 is the move, increasing the pressure on that very, very weak pawn on e4. Of course, for now, it is supported by the knight on c5. Therefore, queen takes e4 is not a threat yet. Now, white goes king to a2, developing his king off the back rank. Black does the same, king to a7, and now we have rook c to f1, sliding over with that rook. Now here, the strongest move for black is actually rook to g8, getting his rook behind that very important pawn on g5. Instead, Magnus goes g4, pushing his pawn down the board, but this move turns out to be considerably weaker, and here Vincent has a very simple tactical shot to nearly decide the game on the spot. And if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Vincent Keymer right here in this position. Of course, the key move for white is gonna be rook to f7, pressuring both the queen on h7 and that pawn on f7. For example, rook f7 is the strongest move. If black takes the pawn on h2, queen takes h2, then you can just go rook 1 to f2, defending b2 in advance, and of course, you will win that pawn on c7 and have a massive attack. But instead of all this, here in this position, queen c3 was played, defending b2 with the queen in advance, and this move is a lot weaker, and here Magnus is going to have chances to fight back in this game. All right, black continues, knight to f3, pressuring the weak pawn on the h2 square. Now we have rook g2, sliding over with the rook and pressuring the g4 pawn. Now rook g8 also defends that pawn on g4. Now we have rook f to f2, jumping up with the rook. Now we have rook d6, sliding over with the rook, queen to e3, king to a8, and here Vincent Keymer, he plays a very, very strong idea, knight to e6, jumping in with the knight, pressuring c7, and potentially forcing out a weakening move from black. And here in this position, Magnus Carlsen, overall, he's still doing relatively okay so far in this game, but right here, he makes an absolutely fatal mistake. He plays the move c6. Now, what is the problem with this move? It turns out white has a very powerful tactical idea, taking advantage of some of the weaknesses in the black camp right here, right now. And if you like puzzles, once again, pause the video and try to find the key idea for black right here in this position. Well, it turns out white is going to slide his queen over, queen to a3, pressuring the weak rook on d6. And have a look at this. No matter what black does in this position, he is going to be in a lot of trouble. Now, what did black do in the game? It turns out Magnus Carlsen, he's in so much pressure, he actually gave up his rook for the knight. Rook takes e6. However, that was not the end of his problems. And real fast, I want to point out, no matter what you do here as black, you are in a lot of trouble. If you go rook d8, you lose the rook to knight takes d8. Instead, rook d7 is met by knight to f8, forking the rook on d7 and the queen on h7. Instead, if you go, say, I don't know, queen to e7 here, trying to defend that rook, then simply rook takes f3 wins that knight, as if you take the rook, you win the rook on g8. No matter what black does here, he is in a tremendous amount of pressure. Now, I do want to point out the strongest move, according to the engine, is c5 here. The idea being if you take the pawn, then black goes rook to d7, and here if you go knight to f8, then bang, queen takes e4, picks up that pawn, and black is going to have a decent amount of counterplay. Now instead, in the game, rook takes e6 was chosen by the goat, white takes back, d takes e6, and here the final move of the game is simply rook to c8, and here in this position, Magnus Carlsen, he actually resigned on the spot to Vincent Keymer. I mean, white is just completely winning in this position. There are many different ways to win. The strongest move here is simply rook takes g4, winning that free pawn, threatening queen takes f3, and so on. And as you can see by the eval bar on the left, showing plus 5.4 pawns, I mean, that is just a tremendous advantage. So it's very understandable why Magnus did resign in this position. Either way, Magnus, he lost his first semifinals game against Vincent Keymer. But of course, the semifinals match is a best of 2 game scenario, meaning tomorrow Magnus will play Vincent Keymer as white with the same starting position, and he will have his chance to fight back and try to equalize the score and go to tie breaks. But if he doesn't do that, if Vincent Keymer holds on and gets at least a draw, Magnus will be out in the tournament. That would be a truly shocking turn of events. So stick around until tomorrow to see what happens there, but don't go anywhere. We've also got 2 incredible Title Tuesday games. The first one featuring Magnus Carlsen versus Hikaru Nakamura. So Let's load it up here and dive right in. All right, diving into our second game of today, we have Hikaru Nakamura versus Magnus Carlsen. These two have a very long-standing rivalry. This game did take place in the Title Tuesday tournament, which took place today, and this game features a very aggressive line of the martial attack, a very unusual line, not drawish at all. It's going to be a good game. Stick around. Let's dive right in. All right, in the game, Hikaru opens 1 e4, best by test. Magnus goes e5. Then we have knight to f3, knight c6, and the good old-fashioned Roy Lopez opening is the weapon of choice. And now from here, Magnus does go for the martial attack. We're going to speed through these moves. a6, bishop a4, knight f6, short castles, very standard stuff. Here the open Roy Lopez is knight takes e4. The molar is bishop c5, but instead, bishop e7 played in this game, heading for the martial. Now here the two main moves for white include d3 and rook to e1. In this game, Hikaru does go rook to e1. Now we have b5, bishop b3, and finally, the key martial attack move is simply short castle. And so far, both sides have wasted literally 1 second left on the clock to get here. They started with 3 minutes. They have 2 minutes, 59 seconds each, both sides blitzing out their moves so far. Now here, white has a very large number of anti-martial lines he can play. For example, a4, a3, d3, h3, and so on are all very playable here for white. Instead, in the game though, white does go c3, allowing d5, allowing black to get his martial attack just as he wants. And here, Magnus goes straight for it. d5 is the move, the key martial attack idea. The point being, you are giving up that pawn on the e5 square, as we're going to see. Now here we have e takes d5, then knight takes d5, then knight takes, and finally rook takes e5. And here white is officially up a single pawn, that being the pawn on e5. He now has the extra pawn on the d file, and it's going to be a race between black trying to attack white on the king side and white trying to unwind and develop his queen side without getting checkmated. Now here, of course, the main line for black is c6, supporting knight on d5, then white goes d3 or d4, and black typically goes bishop d6, followed by queen to h4, targeting the weak pawn on h2. Now, instead of all this, in the game, Magnus, he plays a very, very strange, very unusual move, and as we can see, he is wasting quite a few seconds on this move right here. He goes bishop b7. What is the idea? Well, you support the knight on d5 with the bishop, but overall, this bishop needs to be on this diagonal if black wants to get a vicious attack going against the white king. Instead, on b7, it's a little bit more awkwardly placed, and it's going to be harder for black to attack the white king. So what is the idea here? Well, Magnus, I think he's trying to throw Hikaru off his game and throw him a curveball in this blitz game. All right, Hikaru continues. d4, very logical, gaining space in the center of the board. Now black, bishop f6, pressuring the rook on e5 and forcing it back. Now we have rook to e1, the rook retreats, and now black goes rook to e8, challenging the white rook on the e1 square. Now we have a trade of rooks. Rook takes e8, and then queen takes e8. Both sides blitzing out their moves pretty fast so far, but I do want to point out, Hikaru Nakamura, he's only got 2 minutes and 17 seconds left on the clock so far. That twist idea, bishop b7 instead of c6, is paying off for Magnus. He is getting a lead on the clock so far. All right, now it turns out the strongest move here for white is going to be queen to f1, sliding the queen over. The point being, the queen does defend the king side very, very well. Instead, in the game, bishop takes d5 was chosen, giving up the bishop for that knight on d5. But that bishop, that light squared bishop, is just so important for white's position. And here black already is starting to take over in this game, despite being a pawn down. We have bishop takes d5, and now look at the difference in the quality of these pieces. Black obviously has that bishop pair, but beyond that, these two Bs are very, very active in the center of the board. The queen controls the e file, and all of white's pieces are still on their original squares, except for the king on g1. All right, white tries to unwind. Knight d2 is the move for Hikaru, a solid choice. And here the best move for black, believe it or not, is c5, giving up a second pawn temporarily. Instead, in the game, b4 was chosen, trying to soften up that queen side, and here Hikaru finds the key idea, c4, gaining space. The point being that pawn on b5 is no longer there. It no longer controls c4, and therefore c4 is an excellent move for white, driving back that very strong bishop on d5. Now black goes bishop e6, retreating his bishop. White goes d5, gaining more space in the center of the board, driving it back yet again. And now black goes bishop f5. Now we have knight f1. The point being, the knight white is likely heading to the e3 square, where it does clog up the e-file and pressure the weak bishop on f5. Now here black is not waiting around. He goes queen to e4, flying in with the queen and pressuring the center of the board. Now white goes knight g3 instead of knight to e3. The point being, with that queen on the e4 square, when you go knight g3, you do fork both the queen and the bishop. That means the bishop is going to come off the board one way or another. Now here black goes queen d3, offering the queen trade, and very interestingly, Hikaru, he doesn't trade immediately. Instead, he actually goes queen to b3, giving black the choice to trade on b3, but white will get the open a file. And I do want to point out, here in this position, you have no time for knight takes f5, as then black just takes the queen on d1, queen takes d1 would be the move, and black is simply winning on the spot. Instead, here, queen to b3 played in the game, and black does take the queen. We have queen takes b3, then a takes b3, winning back the queen, and now bishop to c2. That pawn on c2 is as good as gone, as the only way to defend it would be rook to a3, but that move loses the rook on the spot to b takes a3. Therefore, that pawn on on b3 will be lost. All right, now we have knight h5, jumping up with the knight. Bishop d4 is the move in response, and now bishop e3, offering the bishop trade, and Magnus does go for it. We have bishop takes, then f takes, then bishop takes b3, and black has officially equalized the game in terms of material. Both sides now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns, and I gotta say, these pawns on c4 and d5 are looking very, very weak to me. Here, white goes rook c1, trying to defend the pawn on c4, but Magnus is not done. He goes a5, advancing his queenside pawn majority. Of course, his idea is a4, then a3, trying to get a past alpha 0 a pawn on the a file. Now here, white, the strongest move, it turns out, is knight to g3. This move is very tricky, but you have to play it. Here is the main line. White goes knight g3, black goes a4, then you go knight to e4, and from e4, the knight has access to the d2 square. That is the key idea behind knight g3. Instead, in the game, white actually goes knight to f4, and from f4, that knight is never going to have access to d2. It's 4 moves away from that square, and this is going to spell a lot of trouble for white in this game. All right, black continues. a4, gaining space on the queen side. The threat, of course, is simply a3, trying to get a pass pawn on that a file. Now we have knight d3, the knight drops back, and finally a3, then b takes and b takes. Now black officially has the pass pawn on the a file. However, white also has good chances to make a pass pawn in the center of the board in the future with ideas like c5 and then d6. Therefore, if white can defend, he may be doing okay, but for now, that pass pawn on a3 is very, very dangerous. White continues, knight c5, jumping up with the knight. Black goes rook to b8, trying to defend the bishop on the b3 square. Now here, in this position, white's got to find the key idea, king to f2. That is the best way to stay in the game. Instead, white here goes rook to a1, trying to blockade that pawn on a3. However, this move has a serious tactical flaw, as you can see by the eval bar literally collapsing on the left side of your screen. Now, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the unbelievable tactical idea for black in this position. This move is a double exclamation point move. It is a total and complete shocker. That is a one hint for you. All right, the key idea here for black, believe it or not, is bishop to a2. What is the idea? This is a clean sacrifice of the bishop. The point being, though, you're threatening rook to b1, trading off those rooks after rook takes, then bishop takes, and from there, this pawn would have a very easy time advancing. And if you take the bishop, here is the key idea. If you take it, you go rook b1, king f2 is forced, then you go rook b2, forking the king on f2 and the rook on a2. And if you take the rook after rook takes a takes, this pawn is going to promote. There is nothing you can do to stop it. That is the reason why bishop a2 all the way back in this position is so strong. You force off the rooks and this pawn will promote one way or the other. Instead, in the game, bishop takes c4 was chosen by Magnus, and he had a lot of time to make this move. He had 1 minute and 18 seconds left, and he didn't find the idea of bishop to a2, and that may have cost him the victory in this game, because here white simply goes rook takes a3, winning that pass pawn on the a file, and now we have something pretty close to a level game. Of course, there's a lot to play for in this endgame. Let's see who comes out on top. All right, black continues. Bishop takes d5, winning yet another pawn. He's officially up a pawn in the endgame. White goes e4, driving back that bishop. Then we have bishop to c6, rook to a7, pressuring the weak pawn on c7, and then rook to c8 does defend. Now we have knight to a6, jumping up with the knight. The rook and the knight now pressure that pawn on c7. Black goes bishop takes e4, winning yet another pawn, but giving up that pawn on c7 in the process. Now we have rook takes c7, and then rook to a8. Very interesting. Black keeping the rooks on the board. Magnus Carlsen here, he is playing for a win, and he knows with those rooks on the board, his winning chances will be a little bit higher, especially considering white is down on the clock. He only has 30 seconds left versus the 1 minute and 2 second of Magnus Carlsen. All right, now knight c5 is the move, dropping back with the knight and pressuring the weak bishop on e4. Then we have bishop f5, knight to b3, and then g6. Now we have rook c1, white dropping back with the rook, protecting the first rank. And now we have king g7, then rook e1, rook d8, king f2, and then g5, gaining space. Now rook to e2, king to f6. Magnus slowly but surely improving the placement of his pieces. He is clearly playing for a win here. All right, rook d2 is the move, offering the rook trade. And once again, Magnus does decline. Rook b8 is the move, pressuring the knight on the b3 square. Then knight d4. Then we have bishop to e4, rook to e2, bishop d5, rook d2, rook to a8, knight to c6. Of course, that knight cannot be taken. I mean, you can take it, but after bishop takes and then rook d6, you win back the piece immediately. So Magnus here, not falling for that trick. After knight c6, he does go bishop to e6, keeping those minor pieces alive for now. Then we have knight d4, dropping back with the knight, pressuring the bishop once again. Then h5, gaining space. And then we have knight takes e6, and then f takes e6. Very interesting. Magnus recapturing with the pawn instead of the king. Perhaps he thinks his winning chances are a little bit higher here. All right, white continues. Rook b2, then king to f5, h3, and then h4, locking down those pawns on the king's side. Then rook b3, then rook to a2, hits the king, king to f3, and then e5, gaining space in the center yet again. And now here, the key move for white to stay in the game is g4, gaining space, and even if black does take en passant, you are doing just fine after king takes. Instead, in the game, rook to b4 was chosen, and this move turns out to be a fatal mistake. Black goes rook to a3, hitting the king on the f3 square, then king to f2, and then e4, gaining even more space. Now we have rook b8, flying back with the rook, rook to a2, king to e3, rook a3, king f2, and here, the key idea for black is simply rook a2 once again, and black should be able to break through. For example, rook a2, king g1, king f4, the king's coming to e3, and so on. But instead, in this position, here black simply goes rook g3, and from here, Hikaru finds a way to hang on. He goes rook to f8, hitting the king, forcing king to e5, then rook e8, king d4, rook d8, king e5, and from here, both sides go for a draw by repetition. Of course, white is guarding the e3 square, therefore king to e3 is not possible, and black is going to be able to check the black king forever. We have rook e8, king f4, rook f8, then king to e5, then finally rook to e8 once again, and here both sides are forced to agree to a draw by a threefold repetition. Wow, what a game between Magnus and Hikaru in the Title Tuesday tournament on chess.com. But don't go anywhere. I've got yet another incredible game coming up for you right now. This one features Magnus Carlsen and Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave from the same tournament, the Title Tuesday tournament in 2025. All right, our final game of today is Magnus Carlsen versus Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, the Frenchman from the Title Tuesday tournament from this week on February 11, 2025. And this game features a very wacky line of the Sveshnikov Sicilian. You don't want to miss this. Let's dive right in. All right, in the game, Magnus opens 1 e4, and of course, black does go 1 c5. Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave is one of the biggest specialists in the Najdorf Sicilian in the world these days. Of course, the Najdorf occurs after knight f3, then d6, and so on. However, instead, in in this game, Magnus makes a very, very unusual move on move 2. He actually goes knight e2. Now, what is the idea behind this move? I think it's called the chameleon Sicilian. The idea being, if black goes d6, you retain the option of going d4, transposing back to an open Sicilian, but you also have other ideas. For example, knight c3, g3, bishop g2, and so on is also possible. Now here, black goes knight c6, a very good move in theory. However, if white goes d4, sooner or later, black will have a Sveshnikov Sicilian, and he may not be a specialist in that line. Now here, knight bc3 is the move, knight f6, and then sure enough, Magnus does go d4, transposing back to an open Sicilian. But here, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, he does not get a Najdorf. Instead, he's heading for some sort of Sveshnikov, Kalashnikov, classical, something else. It's going to be something he is not a specialist in. Now here, black trades on d4, c takes d4, knight takes, and sure enough, e5 is the move. That is the strongest move according to the engine, driving back that knight, and we have this Sveshnikov Sicilian on the board. Now here, white goes knight b d5. That is the main line. Black goes d6, and now we do have bishop g5 on the board. Black goes a6, driving back that knight. We have knight a3, and then b5. And here, white's two main options, of course, are knight d5, immediately jumping in with that knight, and also bishop takes f6, trading the bishop for the knight and trying to damage black's pawn structure, and then go knight d5. Now, in the game, Magnus does go for the positional line. That is simply knight d5 immediately. The main line now goes bishop e7, then bishop takes, and here white has a choice once again. You can go c3 or c4. Either of these moves are excellent. So, which line does he go for? In the game, Magnus goes c4, and this line is a little bit less common than c3. Perhaps Magnus was trying to mix things up and throw Maxime off guard. Now here, the main line continues, b4, then knight to c2, and then a5. However, instead, Maxime, he throws a big curveball as well. He goes knight d4, and this move is incredibly unusual. You almost never see it from black, and on d4, it's not really obvious what that knight is accomplishing. All right, here, turns out the strongest move for white is winning that free pawn on b5. Of course, you have 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking it versus just 1, 2 defending, and you can just trade on b5. The main line goes c takes, then bishop e6 from black. However, instead in the game, Magnus here, he actually just goes knight c2, retreating his knight and pressuring the knight on d4. Now here, black has the option of just trading on c2, then going bishop e6, and he would have a relatively equal game. Instead, though, he actually goes bishop b7, pressuring the knight on d5. This game continues to get weirder and weirder. Now here, white takes on d4, knight takes d4, then e takes, and of course, with that bishop on f6, that pawn on d4 is defended for now. Therefore, queen takes d4 is not a possibility. All right, white continues, bishop d3. Then we have short castles, b takes, bishop takes, and then here rook to e8, developing the rook. However, I do want to point out, this rook was perhaps better placed on f8 instead of e8. Instead, the right way forward here for black is g6, intending bishop g7, and maybe even a fast f5 break after, say, king to h8. So overall, this rook did belong on f8 instead of e8, but instead, in the game, rook to e8 was played by the Frenchman. Now here, white continues queen d3, centralizing his queen. Black goes rook to b8. Then we have b3, g6, rook a to c1, and then a5, gaining space on the queen side. But again, bishop g7, intending king to h8, and maybe even a fast f5, again, was the right way forward. Now after a5, the problem with this move is you give up control of that b5 square. And here, Magnus jumps in immediately with the move bishop b5, pressuring the weak rook on e8. Now here, black goes rook to e6, getting his rook off the back rank. Then we have bishop c6, moving the bishop up, pressuring the weak bishop on b7, threatening bishop takes b7, and what is black going to do about it? Well, in the game, he actually goes bishop c8, retreating the bishop and keeping those two b's on the board for now. Now we have knight takes f6, queen takes f6, and then rook fd1, developing the rook and threatening queen takes d4. Now black goes rook b4, flying down with the rook. Then we have a3, driving back that rook to b8, and then finally queen takes d4, and here Magnus is in complete control. He has the extra pawn and the better pawn structure and the more active pieces. I mean, Magnus here is just completely dominating the board. All right, black goes queen takes d4, trading off the queens, then rook takes d4, and now will black win that pawn on the b3 square? It turns out no, he will not. If you do that, then the simple response is just bishop d5. forking both the rooks on d5 and b3. That would be enough to win the game on the spot. So rook takes b3 is not a good idea. With that in mind, what should black be doing here? Well, it turns out the best move is simply bishop b7, challenging that white bishop on c6. Instead, in the game, king g7 was chosen, and this move is quite a bit weaker. And here's the problem. White can simply go b4, gaining space, threatening b5. This is what Magnus did in the game. Now we have bishop b7, but it is too late. b5 is the move, supporting that bishop with the pawn on b5. Now black takes, but white takes back with the b pawn. B takes c6, and that pawn on c6 is just a monster. That is going to give black a whole lot of problems in this endgame. All right, Maxime continues. Rook to c8, challenging the pawn on c6. White goes f3, bolstering his pawn on the e4 square. Then we have king to f6, rook d5, rook to a8, defending the pawn on a5 from the rook on d5. Then we have c7, threatening c8, promoting to a queen. Therefore, rook c8 is forced immediately. Now we have rook takes a5, winning that free pawn on the a5 square. Black can threaten rook e7, and black goes rook e7, threatening rook takes c7. Now we have rook a7, defending the pawn, and white here is officially up 2 pawns in the endgame, the pawn on c7 and the pawn on a3. Now we have king e6, a4, king d7, rook to b7, rook e5, king to f2, white slowly but surely bringing all his pieces into the game. Then we have rook to a5, rook to c4, jumping up with the rook and defending the pawn on a4. Now black here, he lashes out. He goes for the move d5, trying to get some sort of counterplay. Not a bad idea at all. White takes, black takes back, rook takes d5. Then we have rook to b5, offering the rook trade. Now we have rook d2, hitting the king, king to e3, rook takes g2, Maxime winning back one of those pawns, but of course that rook is so far away from the defense of the queen side, and white is going to try to push through these pawns here on c7 and a4. Rook d5 is the move, hitting the king, king to e7, then rook to e4, driving back the king once again, king to f6, rook d7, rook takes h2, and now rook to c4, defending the pawn on c7 with the other rook, and therefore threatening rook to d8. Now we have rook to e8, hitting the king, king to d3, rook to h1, king to c2, rook to e2, and the last move of the game is simply rook to d2, and in this position, black resigns as there is simply nothing stopping c8 promoting to a queen. Wow, what a game between Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave and Magnus Carlsen in the 2025 Titled Tuesday tournament that happened today on February 11th. Very impressive stuff. Of course, Magnus did lose his game to Vincent Keymer, so let's wait until tomorrow to see, can he fight back, win that game, and then win in tiebreaks, or will Vincent Keymer walk away with the victory in that one-on-one match and head straight to the finals? It'll be very interesting to see what happens there. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video.